Go ahead.
Wasn't that the law that or the resolution that Congress passed right after 9/11, giving the president all?
Actually, no, it was not. It had nothing to do with 9/11. This has been around for a long time. The War Powers Resolution.
Was it that he could send troops anywhere for 9/11?
Yeah, that's what it was. The War Powers Resolution basically says that the President of the United States, for the 60-day time period, can send troops abroad for any reason whatsoever. So, for example, let's say that there were a lot of alleged terrorists that were over in Turkey. The United States President would not have to go and get any permission from Congress. He could send troops to Turkey, bomb, invade, all of those things for 60 days. On day 61, the troops have to come back unless Congress approves. Unless Congress approves.
Kill them all.
What would this be an example of?
Checks and balances.
Yeah, it would. It would be an example of checks and balances. And this would be Congress basically balancing or checking the president's war-making power. Go ahead.
You said on the 61st day they would have to come back?
As long, if Congress does not, basically, and this is what we had talked about, there's two things with this. The president has the power on day 60. On day 61, Congress now has the power. Now, what happened in Iraq was on day 61, Congress didn't follow through.
Okay,
so yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I'm glad you brought that up. So, do they have to come back? No. If Congress wants them to come back, yes. And if you remember when we had talked about this, I had suggested, you know, Bush deserves responsibility, but Congress does too, and they still do for what's going on over in Iraq. We can't forget about that. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. What else have you got from two? And actually, one of the articles, who's got the power to declare war?
Congress.
Congress. What's the difference between the president and Congress's war power?
The president, doesn't he decide how the money's spent?
Okay.
Like the finances?
As soon as Congress declares war, it's the president's job, essentially, after that, to enact that declaration of war however he sees fit.
Yeah. It's basically the difference between declaring and making war. And when you think back to it, the president has the power to declare, or pardon me, the Congress has the power to declare war, and it is only a majority vote of Congress that does this. If you remember from the article, they divided it up because this was such an awesome power. They didn't just want to give it to one individual. They wanted to spread it out over hundreds of elected officials. But once that declaration is made, or once Congress authorizes the president to act in terms of military forces, if you will, at that point the president now has got the control. He's got to report to the members of Congress, but the president as commander-in-chief has got the ability to make war. Unlimited for those first 60 days, if you will, but even once you get that declaration, the president has got a significant amount of power. So bear that in mind. Go ahead, Jack.
Okay, so Congress gives the green light and the president has to do the driving?
Yeah, that's a good way of saying it. Congress gives the green light and the president drives. That's a really good way of saying it. Go ahead.
Can the Congress declare war and the president refuses?
That's never happened.
But it can happen.
You know, it's never happened. So that would be a debate that we probably don't have time for in the next 35 minutes, although that's a really good question. Go ahead.
Couldn't we extend the time? Like, if it's okay with
I
everyone
might
else?
not be able to film it all. That's the only issue with that. I'm sure we could extend it conceivably. Go ahead, Josh.
But the president has the power to make war without congressional declaration.
For up to 60 days, or unless Congress gives that joint resolution, which is what happened in Iraq. They gave a joint authorization of force, and that was something else we had spoken about. What else from two?
1808 was...
Okay, what was 1808? Go ahead.
Was that when slave trade was banned?
Yeah. Okay. When you go back, there were probably several ways that the original Constitution addressed slavery. And slavery, if you remember, was one of the big controversies back then. 1808 was one such way. What were they trying to do with this?
By stopping the flow of slaves into the United States, I figured it would die out within 20 years.
That's right. The sense was that they passed the Constitution, it took effect, 1789, Washington comes into office. And they basically said, okay, we're going to give you 20 years. We are not going to ban slavery because if we tried to do this, the Constitution would never pass. So we're going to ban the slave trade. And we're going to give you 20 years, southern states, slave states, to wean yourself off of using slaves in your economy. Okay, the sense was that if they ended it immediately, Constitution would have never passed, slavery or the slave trade. But if they gave them time, they would be able to work themselves off. So in 1808, as soon as the slave trade ended, the slaves would die off, slavery would go away. But what happened?
The opposite got worse.
It got worse. Why did it get worse? What do you mean the exact opposite? Go ahead.
Because the people, the slave owners were for lack of a better term, breeding or forcing them to have sex so they could make more slaves? Or
I don't remember talking about forcing them to have sex and all that, but basically what it was, was that it actually accelerated slavery. Because they brought in more and more slaves to the point where they wouldn't need the slave trade, and then, yeah, they began to breed to the point where they weren't going to have to trade overseas. It actually made the roots of slavery go deeper. What was another or a second way that the original Constitution dealt with slavery?
Didn't they say they weren't going to deal with it for 20 years?
Well,
Like
that's...
our property, or
What's that now?
like slaves are our property, and
Slaves were considered property, but what else? Go ahead, Matt.
The 3/5 compromise?
What was 3/5 compromise?
That 5 slaves was equal to 3?
5 slaves is equal to 3 people, and basically what they were saying for representation and taxation purposes. The South wanted the representation, so when they got 3/5, they got extra representation in Congress. The North wanted taxation for the government, so when they got the 3/5 part of this, they basically got extra revenue that their states weren't going to have to pay to the federal government. Irony is that the northern states wanted a slave to count as a person for taxes, but not for votes. Southern states wanted them to count for votes and not for taxes. 3/5, basically nobody got what they wanted, but really the group that got screwed on it was the slaves. Because if you say 5 slaves equals 3 people, what are you saying? You're saying that slaves are less than people, they're less than human, which means they're basically, you can treat them as property and get away with it. One other thing, and this may have been one of the questions from the chapter, but it was the idea of, there was the fugitive slave clause in there. And if you remember, I think I mentioned this just real brief, but the full faith and credit clause, one of the things it was designed to do is if a slave ran away, they would be, if they were caught, obliged to be returned back to the state where they were taken from. So there were some runaway slave provisions in there as well, but 3/5 and 1808 are kind of the big ones. What else you got? Go ahead.
The ERA wasn't actually,
What was the ERA?
it was an amendment.
Yeah, what's it called?
Equal Rights Amendment.
Equal Rights Amendment. So talk to me about it. What's the question?
Did it actually, it wasn't actually made a part of the Constitution.
Is the Equal Rights Amendment part of the Constitution? No, it is not part of the Constitution. It came very, very close, but it never passed. What was the purpose behind the Equal Rights Amendment? Go ahead.
To make women kind of equal to men and
To make women kind of equal.
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Because then they didn't think that women were as,
They didn't think that women were equal.
to men, yeah.
Yeah.
And they
More considered
wanted
property.
women and men to be earning the same.
Ah, so pay. What does a typical woman earn in reference to what a man earns today?
Like 60 cents to $1.
Yeah, it's about 75%. And when they were proposing the Equal Rights Amendment, it was probably closer to half. So it's already improved even though it wasn't in there. What was the key word in ERA?
equal?
Gender.
Gender. Why do you say gender?
Because that could mean, it could mean, transgender people?
Transgender people. We talked about transgender people in class.
I don't remember.
No.
Then we talked about that right after we were forcing the slaves to have sex. Okay, go ahead, Catherine.
It fell into the possibility of creating issues in terms of allowing gay marriage or allowing 2 people of the same sex.
Yeah, that is exactly what it was. If you remember when we had spoken about ERA, I had mentioned to you that the purpose behind it, the original intent, if you will, and I believe that's one of the terms up here. The original intent of the writers was to address the economic inequality that Kafura mentioned. But when you think about a word like gender, if you're talking about equal treatment based on gender or not denying equal treatment on account of gender, then basically if man and woman can get married,